If I could purge my memories of the opening hour and first major boss encounter, it would be easier to recommend Thymesia as one of the better 3D Souls-like games to emerge in some time, especially when you consider it comes from a tiny Taiwanese studio with limited budget. However, like so many other attempts at emulating From Software's iconic title, it's obvious that designing a game to be both challenging and rewarding is no easy task. A good Souls-like features difficult boss fights, but they can always be bested through pattern recognition, improving player skill, and an evolving character build. There's a steady escalation of encounter complexity and difficulty that challenges you, but also motivates you to push forward and keep testing the limits of your skill or your build. Often, there are multiple paths and encounters given to you at any time should you run into a seemingly insurmountable difficulty spike. Now, in contrast, Thymesia's opening hour feels designed to kick you in the teeth repeatedly while giving you no alternative but to grind one area if you want to improve your stats and gear. If you tough it out and defeat the first boss, both phases, back-to-back, with a large moveset and a low-health super that can wreck an otherwise good attempt, your reward is a game that fluctuates wildly in difficulty. Having said that, I don't want to come across as if Thymesia has nothing going for it, as the combat can be fun, it's just not always a good fit for the genre. Thymesia is a visually stylish and attractive game, even though it's not pushing any boundaries. Character movement, combat animation, especially the executions and special attacks, and the enemy designs all look good. Each region has a distinct aesthetic and atmosphere, but they're discrete levels that lack sweeping vistas or a sense of interconnected space. Thymesia gets a lot of mileage out of its 4 regions, and if you tackle the submissions, which eventually unlock an optional boss, you'll be retreading the same space with only a few new paths and shortcuts. On the audio front, attacks, parries, and executions all sound meaty and impactful, while the music sounds like twisted variants of common fairy tale themes. Thymesia also runs well on a variety of platforms, even the budget Xbox Series S, which holds 60 frames per second and only rarely drops inputs. It's a good thing too, as the fast-paced combat, inspired more by Bloodborne than Dark Souls, relies on responsive inputs and minimal latency. Moving on to the meat of the game, Thymesia's combat, after a few upgrades, can feel like it was pulled from a dedicated action game and transplanted into a Souls-like framework. It looks and feels great, combos flow together, and there's no stamina bar to worry about. Success is all about moving in for a few strikes, dashing out of range, parrying when possible, and interrupting critical strikes to open gaps in enemy defense. There's a satisfying wound system that becomes essential to defeating tougher enemies and bosses. Basic attacks inflict wounds before removing health, so you're encouraged to mix in Plague Claw strikes, and strip away total health while gaining energy, and if you finish them off with a charged attack, you can gain a single-use plague weapon. The energy pool is used to summon upgradable plague weapons or abilities at any point, which you can then upgrade by collecting associated weapon shards from fallen foes. You could think of these as situational secondary tools that offer a trade-off between energy cost, damage, and animation length, and are often essential for finishing off bosses and mini-bosses. Many are just heavy weapon strikes, but some also apply status effects to your saber or feather attacks. Thymesia's leveling system initially feels like simplified Souls fare. There are only 3 stats to improve, and 6 related attributes, no armor or accessory system, and only a saber and plague claws for your basic attacks, with a recharging set of feathers that act as a ranged secondary attack to aggro enemies or interrupt critical strikes. However, the further you get, the more memory fragments you collect, think souls, and the more upgrade materials you gather, the more freedom you get to specialize your build. In addition to increasing basic attributes, each upgrade rewards you with a point to invest in one of 6 skill trees, with powerful combat and passive buffs. Examples include increasing saber or feather attack damage, gaining energy on strikes or counters, and increasing material drop rates. Given the alchemy-themed narrative, you can also upgrade 3 variants of potions, standard, long, and fast-acting. To make them more effective, add more charges, or infuse them with up to 3 ingredients that add extra properties like bonus healing, temporary damage resistance, or temporary damage boost. On paper, and against many foes, the combat and upgrade mechanics shine. At this point, it's worth briefly mentioning Thymesia's paper-thin narrative and minimal world building. The distinctly Bloodborne-inspired protagonist, Corvus, alongside their mysterious female companion, is attempting to purge a kingdom of a blood plague by delving into his confused recollections that involve a woman with an eye patch, suggesting some events have already come to pass. Beyond that, however, there's little to go on until the finale. Admittedly, this is a genre that shies away from direct storytelling, but Thymesia's loading screen snippets, one-sided conversations with rare NPCs, and abundance of scattered notes are all brief, bland, and not particularly effective at building up an overview of the world in your mind. It's enough to keep you going, but if you're after a narrative as deep as the mechanics, you'll be disappointed. Now, returning to my major criticisms, the inconsistent challenge comes from A, the gulf in difficulty between basic foes and some variants of mini-boss, and B, a small selection of mandatory and optional bosses that, with the exception of the finale, are all easier than the first one you face. Basic enemies are easy to dispatch and primarily used for ambushes or complicating fights against tougher foes. With a few upgrades, they even serve as a means to quickly restore health, gain energy, or single-use plague weapons. The mini-bosses, however, are significantly harder to wound and kill, always pack hard-hitting weapons, and walk through your attacks. Suddenly you're chipping away at tiny slivers of health while dealing with combos that can strip most of your health if you miss a parry or block late. Those with reach, think greatswords, spears, or halberds, are a particular pain in the arse, able to dash around despite the massive weapons, track you, and land blows when you think you're well out of range. You encounter all variants in each region, so there's no sense of steady progression towards tougher encounters. The ultimate challenge should, of course, be the boss fights, but these are also all over the place when it comes to difficulty, with several less of a challenge than the mini-bosses I defeated on my way to them. The first boss, a two-phase fight against a fast-moving target with a myriad of melee and range attacks, was tougher than most subsequent battles, and took me an hour of grinding and around a dozen attempts to defeat. The second boss, in contrast, was heavy-hitting, but clearly telegraphed their limited number of attacks, and could be defeated quickly if I just kept up my saber combos. A mutated form of the first boss, one of the submission encounters, was tough, but still easier than his first form, and had only a single phase to defeat. It's also worth noting I never had to grind to defeat any of the subsequent bosses. Sure, some are gimmicky with insta-kill attacks or force you to run a gauntlet first, but there's no consistent escalation of difficulty. My second issue will, of course, be refuted by skilled players, but coming from someone who plays a handful of 2D and 3D Souls-like games each year between other genres, I found Thymesia's combat mechanics weird and frustrating when going up against tougher foes. Bosses and mini-bosses rarely get stunned, they can recover and attack faster than you, they dash away further than your follow-up attacks carry, they can parry at any point in your combo, track you with unerring accuracy during their own combos, and strike through all your attacks. Hell, if you manage to interrupt a critical strike and induce a brief stagger state, it's unwise to engage with anything other than a plague weapon attack, as they can recover instantly into a parry. No matter what you do, if you're going to deal damage on Thymesia, you're almost always going to take damage. I found it odd as action games typically have a strong focus on staggering or juggling combos, whereas Thymesia has enemies that show complete ambivalence to your attacks, an opaque counter-gauge system, and inconsistent timing for critical strike interrupts. It's no exaggeration to say that 90% of my deaths came from enemy combos ripping through my remaining health bar, while I was trapped in an uninterruptible plague weapon attack that they simply shrugged off. Once I had cleared that initial roadblock, I started enjoying Thymesia a lot more, though I think a big part of that was the satisfaction of growing increasingly powerful and venting 2 hours of pent-up rage. Before I could give Thymesia an unreserved recommendation, OverBorder Studio needs to rebalance the experience with some personal patches. A smoother escalating difficulty curve would have made for a more satisfying experience, rather than ramming my head into a brick wall for 2 hours and then tearing through the remaining content. Well, aside from the odd mini-boss that was a more significant challenge than actual bosses.